Economists generally agree that free trade leads to economic growth, lower levels of poverty, and general improvements in well-being. These propositions are supported both by theoretical economic models and empirical data. Further, while the empirical evidence is a little bit more limited on this particular question, the general consensus of economists also hold that trade restrictions are likely to hurt poor people. So even if that turns out to be wrong, though, if free trade does support growth, then free trade would allow governments to have more resources to distribute to the poor. It's surprising then that people writing about global justice don't cite trade liberalization as a way to improve the welfare of the poor as a class. While many philosophers are just silent about the effects of free trade on the poor, some actually argue that liberalized trade is harmful for the poor, contrary to the claims of economists. The economic idea is that increased trade and international trade, globalized trade, leads to more trading partners than you had before, leads to finer and finer divisions of labor, which allow more people to secure the things that they want. More trading partners means more deals to be had. And if you look in 1980, there's a statistic of extreme poverty, and it's somewhere around $1.90 or $2 per day of income. Those who are making less than that in 1980 were 2 billion people worldwide. In the late 90s, that number shrunk by half, over half, to something like 900 million. Today, the number is 700 million. And this represents the first time in human history that the extreme poverty level has dipped below 10% of the worldwide population. This is good news. Now, $2 per day isn't very much. Many people make a lot more. So when we're talking about poverty, we have to distinguish between two kinds of ways of measuring it. One way of thinking about poverty is as a relative measure. Being poor is about having less. Right? The other way of thinking about poverty is as an absolute measure. Rather than having less than somebody else, being poor is about having not enough. Right? So if the problem is people not having enough, if the problem is to save individuals from falling over the edge of bare levels of exigency, then it seems like what we should care about is poverty as the absolute measure, rather than simply people not having enough. In a steady state world, poverty is just a matter of bad distribution. The reason that some people have too little is that others have too much. And so fixing that is simply a matter of effecting a kind of transfer from the one group to the other. But maybe we don't live in a steady state world, right? Maybe rather than thinking of world wealth as a kind of fixed pie where we try to make sure that everybody's slices are more or less equal, we should think about world wealth as something that grows. Would you rather have uh, 1/6 of a pie or 1/20 of a pie? The answer to that question depends on the sizes of the two pies. If the 1/20 slice is of a pie that's much, much, much bigger than the pie of which you're getting 1/6, then it would make sense to prefer the 1/20 slice. So a different approach, rather than simply just rearranging holdings and effecting these transfers to make sure everybody's slice is more or less equal, the main thing should be to try to increase the magnitude of people's holdings so that they have more than they currently do. And the point about globalization is to investigate whether or not this is a way of making that happen. Is it plausible to think, and this is just an empirical issue, is it plausible to think that globalization had something to do, at least, with the recent decline in worldwide poverty? If it did, then globalization is something we should care about morally. Even if that's right, we might worry about some of the other effects of globalization, right? Some of these other effects might make us pause before we extend an unqualified endorsement of globalization. So specifically, we're going to worry about sweatshop labor. So one question to ask is, what are the default protections that, again, just as a default, are afforded to workers? Well, we can think of some, right? Bosses aren't able to just send around their goons to rough up workers. Slavery is not okay. Sometimes these things occur around the world, but the best that any feasible legal regime can do is attempt to deter these things before they happen and to punish the people afterwards. The other kind of protection, so what is typically offered typical workers would be protections from violence and force, and also from fraud, where employers renege on an employment contract that they made with a worker. The worker is also free, of course, to end a relationship with an employer if it has become not to their liking, if it's become oppressive. They can quit the job. Now, admittedly, there are often costs associated with this choice, but that's the nature of transactions in the real world. Right? Another thing that people want to do is to impose further regulations, labor standards, maybe international labor standards to protect workers from oppressive employers. But let's take a look at the of what workers can do short of that. The one I was just talking about is worker mobility. Here's how I guess the argument would go. What we have, the default protections provide, is basically freedom of contract. Employees within a market order have other options than just meekly bowing to the authority of the firm. They can, and should they choose, take their labor elsewhere. They can say what Johnny Paycheck famously sang. They can say, take this job and shove it. And they can do that at their will. Even in the slightest bit of oppression in their workplace, they're at liberty to withdraw their labor and take it elsewhere. The worry, of course, is that this isn't really true. That for most people who work in really, really bad working conditions, those conditions offer the best option that they have. And so their best option is a really, really bad option. The problem then is that they lack options. Right? So the most plausible basis for imposing regulations that protect labor is that there exists a vast disparity in bargaining power between employers and employees. A firm that has thousands of employees will only be marginally diminished by the departure of one employee who's had too much. But for most workers, the job they're fired from is the one and only job that they can have. Their lives are severely impacted by being separated from their primary source of income. And so this formal kind of abstract freedom of contract symmetry between employer and employee is actually belied by the actual circumstances of economic insecurity for workers. And so this is a real problem, and we're going to try to come to grips with it. It's basically a problem of an asymmetry in employer-employee relationships. Okay. First, there's an asymmetry in power, bargaining power. The idea is bosses are just that. They're bosses. They seem to enjoy arbitrary authority over workers concerning the terms of the employment. They either take it or leaving. They either take it or leave it, and leaving it means really, really bad circumstances, poverty, destitution, starvation, maybe even death. And so people who have a prerogative with respect to hiring also enjoy the ultimate authority to fire. And because workers evidently value the jobs they hold over alternative positions, they're vulnerable. They're vulnerable to an arbitrary worsening of their status. And even in an apparently congenial workplace, this is a kind of implicit sword hanging over the heads of workers. And so I think that's a good word for it. In short, employees are vulnerable. And to ease these twin vulnerabilities, justice or fairness or morality requires some minimally necessary labor standards. So this sets up the problem. On the one hand, you have this kind of formal, abstract bargaining symmetry, but on the other hand, you have the real world where things don't work out that way. And so that raises, I'm going to say it raises 4 questions. So what's the cause of it? I've already given the answer to this. The cause is a lack of decent options to the current crappy job, right? The problem is that the current option, where they're in such terrible, vulnerable straits, happens to be their best option. So the cause seems to be a lack of options. What to do about it? That's the second question. Well, again, I guess the idea seems to be, well, what can we do to multiply the options that workers have? Right? That would be the right way to deal with it. But again, how do we do that? The third question is a more theoretical question, a more straightforwardly philosophical question about what makes an agreement voluntary. This will help us realize, so that this will help us recognize coercion when we see it, and whether or not what we have in a typical employment situation is an exploitative situation. So I'm going to try to, in the rest of this lecture, run through some of these questions. So the first question: why are employment options so limited? The flip side of the question is, what explains the power that the firms have over their employees in these instances of worker exploitation? How do they get away with it? I mean, is it the normal outcome that would emerge from a capitalistic free market if government didn't intervene to prohibit it, right? Or we could focus on some of the background causes that resulted in such a crappy set of alternatives in the first place. Obviously, this applies to employees who are working in sweatshop conditions. Now, one of the things we can look back and at least as a starting point, see how Roderick Long approached this question. He said that corporate power, and this would include the bargaining power that they wield with respect to their employees, corporate power, all forms, depends crucially on government intervention in the marketplace. And so the question could be, does his suggestion apply here? Right? We should oppose, we've already talked about opposing grants of monopoly privilege, restrictions on worker mobility. It's very difficult, right? If a worker has really, really bad working conditions in one country, identifies a better option in a different country, it's very difficult for that worker to take that opportunity on, mainly because of government-enforced immigration restrictions. Right? So this would be a practice that restrains competition. It limits workers' options, and it requires many people to stay in a position where this really, really bad option is their best available option because of the intervention. So this Long wanted to provide a kind of answer that said that the most important antidote to imperious and arbitrary inflictions of harms by employers on employees, the best antidote would be the existence of vigorously competitive labor markets where it becomes more of a threat to the employer for the employee to say, if things don't improve, then I'll leave. So there are things that actually do this, that make this unavailable. Occupational licensure provisions in first world countries do the same thing to people. Certain kinds of victimless crime statutes do. Zoning ordinances do. And other any market restrictions that obstruct gains from trade, and especially among the poor. The biggest thing that would affect employment conditions in the third world would be removing immigration restrictions that prevent worker mobility. Economists have argued that if we were to free up borders to have perfectly free worker mobility around the globe, that world GDP, which is currently at $75 trillion, $75 billion, $750 billion, would effectively double. So the idea is that we're losing about the entire globe's wealth every year because of our worldwide immigration policies. And so these policies and others besides have the effect of restricting market entry and so limiting employment options. These fall disproportionately upon poorer, underskilled, undereducated, and historically marginalized members of society. So the answer to the first question, why are employment options so limited? One kind of answer that doesn't frequently get a hearing in these discussions are all sorts of government regulations. What to do about it? Well, the general idea would be don't make it so costly to enter into some employment. Remove institutional restraints to entry into a market, a labor market, that restricts access to them and reduces competition for labor. The problem when you lack options, the reason that the employers are able to exploit these people is because they don't really have to compete for their labor. There's no market incentive to treat them better than they do. But if you remove these institutional restraints that make it difficult for people to find other options, if you remove those, then things would be better for those people. Right? Anything that undermines the vitality of a labor market, leaving the world's poor with so few options, would be an improvement. That's just sort of the same thing. Here's one thing that is really important to know, too. the most frequently cited industry for doing the nasty things in third world countries to employing sweatshop conditions would be the garment industry in Bangladesh, in Africa, in parts of Africa, in Central and South America, in China. These industries actually outpay other jobs in those countries. That's what explains why people take those jobs despite the conditions being so crappy. So these corporations are the best game in town because typically they're the only game in town for these workers. One thing that you might worry about doing, so the question, what to do about it? Taking away that option, the sweatshop option, actually might make things worse for people there. And that's something to worry about because most international labor standards that are being suggested would effectively shut down sweatshops. Is that the right thing to do? If you're looking after if you want to promote the interests of those workers, even further taking away available options to them might be really bad. It's really bad to work in a Cambodian garment sweatshop, but it's even worse to live in Cambodia and have the only labor that you can do be rummaging through garbage heaps for things to sell. Third question, is the choice to work in a sweatshop voluntary? Right, respect for autonomy, respecting the agency of people, requires that people not be allowed to exploit people by making them engage in involuntary transactions, coercing them into doing things that they don't want to do. Coercion impairs a person's agency, it impairs personal autonomy. And so, again, there should be a default protection for making sure that people are only held to the voluntary agreements that they make. And if they don't want to do the work anymore, they shouldn't have to. Again, there are some sweatshops around the world that utilize slave labor. Usually it's prison labor, right? So the Zwolinsky's defense of sweatshops isn't talking about those. He's talking about sweatshop conditions where people show up to work every day under their own steam because given the other available options, it's the best thing that they think that they can do. Right? So why wouldn't a choice to work in a sweatshop be voluntary? Well, if you were forced, if somebody was actively coercing you, if they were threatening you, if they promised certain conditions or certain provisions and then they didn't deliver on those, then that would be engaging in fraud, and that would make your work there involuntary. Right? So coercion is one. What about economic desperation? Does your economic desperation render a person's choice to work in a sweatshop involuntary? Another way to ask this question are agreements that are secured through economic desperation, do they count as coercion? Here's an argument for thinking that the answer to this is yes. Here's the first premise. Given the risks and the conditions, given how bad things are there, people would typically only make these agreements to work there because of poverty and or desperation. Here's a second premise. Agreements that are motivated by poverty and or desperation, they are coercive. Third premise, coercive agreements are not genuinely voluntary. The seller of the thing, in this case labor, isn't sufficiently free with respect to the choice. Therefore, legal provisions are necessary to prevent this coercive situation, to protect the workers' not only interests, but their agency. The key premise, of course, is the second claim. Agreements that are motivated by poverty and or desperation count as coercive. They agree to the employment contract only to prevent their situation from being worse. And so, in a sense, I guess according to this argument, they're coerced by their situations. They're exploited by people who are offering them money. It's a coercive offer. It's an exploitative offer, making the person who agrees to work there worse off. And respect for agency or autonomy requires that individuals be prohibited from engaging in these involuntary transactions that result from coercion, because again, coercion impairs your agency. You're not sufficiently free, as the third premise says. The third premise is just obviously true, right? We know that when I agree to hand over my wallet to someone who's pointing a gun at me, saying, your wallet or your life, the fact that I hand it over to that person doesn't mean that I do so like voluntarily. No, I'm being forced. It's not an agreement, or if it's an agreement, it's one that's been coerced. He's actually stealing from me. Right? So I guess this argument is trading on a kind of analogy between a mugger, someone who mugs me for my money, steals from me, and somebody who makes an offer of a job. The mugger makes me an offer. Do you choose your money or your life? But it's really a false choice. It's a choice that I don't want to have to make. Right? So one way to evaluate this really important second premise is to come up with an account of what it means for an agreement to be genuinely voluntary. We need a theory, a set of necessary and sufficient conditions for a choice being free. And here's a typical one. Right? Here are the set of conditions. So S, a person S, is sufficiently free with respect to choosing something like X equals, by definition, that S wills X. So, so far, if we compare the decision to work in a sweatshop, the decision to hand over my wallet to the mugger, they're on par here. In both cases, the subject wills to do the thing. I willfully hand over my wallet to the mugger. Why? Because I don't want to get shot. I willfully sign up to work in a sweatshop. Why? Because I don't want to starve. The second condition makes things a little bit more difficult. Right? S wants to will X. So the second condition is expressing like an endorsement or a sort of satisfaction with the person's will. There's a consideration, right? Willing the action, and the person wants that consideration to be effective in motivating her when she acts. Right? So this is a sort of attempting to rule out willing X under the influence of some coercive threat. Right? If S wills handing over cash to the mugger, I assume that she wants this will to be effective because she doesn't want to be hurt. It's because of the threat. It's not because she really wants to hand over the money. Right? So it's like I'm not sure. I'm not sure if the second condition does what we want it to do, which is rule out the idea that handing over your wallet to the mugger is sufficiently free and genuinely voluntary. But there's a third condition. Right? S wills X because she wants to will X. I mean, this is getting sort of like iterated on top of, there's levels of willing here. It's not just your base, your immediate will. There's got to be a sort of a reflective endorsement, not only of that will, but of the reasons that you have for wanting to do that. One way to think about this is that the Spice Girls had it right all along. It's not what you want that makes the normative difference here. It's what you really, really want that makes the normative difference. And so you impose these third kind of deliberative conditions about your will. So when we apply this account, we were letting X be hand over your wallet to a mugger. We could also let X be work in sweatshop conditions. So here's where, so the question, I guess, and we can sort of take this up in a different venue or format. Is there a difference between willing to work in a sweatshop and willing to hand over your wallet to a mugger? If there's a difference, then this argument doesn't work. If there's no difference between the case of handing over your wallet to a mugger and the case of deciding to work in a sweatshop, if there's no difference between those two cases, then this argument is a good argument. And it really just depends on whether or not these conditions are satisfied in the relevant decisions. It seems to me that they're not in the case of the mugger. That's just a case of coercion. It's true that I will X. I even kind of want to will X. But the reason I want to will handing over my wallet is the bare fact that the person will kill me if I don't. Right? In the case of I'll let you work through it. In the case of the decision to work in a sweatshop. But clearly they will to work in the sweatshop. They show up every day. And they're not going because somebody is prodding them to go. They show up, again, willingly. But the reason that they want to show up is because they don't want to starve to death. But here's where there might be a difference. If there's a difference, I think it's this. right? Notice that it's the mugger that put me in the circumstances where I had to make the choice between handing over my wallet and being dead. Is that true about the corporation that makes the offer of working in a sweatshop? Do they put the potential employee in the situation so that this really bad option is the best option that they have, which leads them to accept the offer? Well, again, one way to address this is to invoke the argument from Long again, and say, well, no, it's not exactly the corporations that put them in the position. It's a set of policies, bad policies, that limit the mobility and options and the effective competitiveness of the labor market, that allows the corporation to exploit the positions of the worker. Who puts them in the situation where this bad offer is their best offer? Is it the corporation? It's unclear that that's true. In fact, it might be the very entity that people typically now turn to help redress the problem. Final question. Are sweatshops exploitative? The exploitation, we just apply the definition. Exploitation is taking advantage of another person in a way that's unfair or degrading. Obviously, this satisfies the sweatshop conditions satisfy this definition. Corporations, however the employees got in the position where this bad offer is their best offer, corporations are definitely taking advantage of that situation. But I think it would be helpful to distinguish between two forms of exploitation. The first form is harmful exploitation. The second form is mutually beneficial exploitation. Both harmful and mutually beneficial exploitation involve the definition, taking unfair advantage of another person. But in one case, the mutually beneficial sort, both parties come away from the transaction better off than they would have been without it. And so what distinguishes a case of mutually beneficial exploitation from harmful exploitation is that while harmful exploitation is either a zero-sum or a negative-sum game where the exploiter wins at the expense of the exploited, mutual beneficial exploitation is a positive-sum game. Both parties walk away from the transaction, at least to some extent, better off than they were. Again, in the case of a corporation and sweatshop labor, the corporation walks away from the transaction much, much, much better off than the employee walks off better being. But it's still true that so long as that this is their the best available option, if the only other available option would be rummaging around in rubbish heaps looking for things to sell, and they judge that that's not as good as working in the factory, then this represents an offer that is mutually beneficial to the employee. It's still exploitation because the corporation is definitely taking advantage of the situation of the employee, but still mutually beneficial to them. I mean, here's an example, and I'll just close with this example to give you something to think about. Imagine that I'm floating around in a canoe in a big lake, and I see you in the water struggling potentially drowning, about to drown. And I come along and I say, hey, it looks like you could use some help there. And you say, through like struggling and the water gurgling in your mouth, you say, yes, I would really like some help. Will you please pull me into the boat? Again, you say it like a drowning person would. And I say, sure, I'd love to pull you into my boat. Would you agree to an exchange of coming into the boat? That's what I have to offer. You offer like $10,000, right? Definitely, I'm exploiting you. Definitely, I'm taking unfair advantage. But so long as your life to you is worth more than $10,000, you making the agreement and keeping it represents a win-win. I win and you win. You're saved and I am enriched. Um, um, that would be a case of mutually beneficial exploitation. I'm a nasty person. I'm a nasty exploitative person for doing this to you, but it's still mutually beneficial. Um, Imagine a different scenario. It's basically the same thing. You're struggling in the water. I'm floating around in the canoe. But if we would have hit rewind on that scene by about 10 minutes, you would have seen this. You in the canoe with me, and then a little bit later, me pushing you out of the canoe, and then me noticing that you need some help, and then me making this sort of unseemly offer, right? Notice the difference, right? In the first case, your baseline is struggling in the water, needing help, and I come by and exploit that. In the second scenario, your baseline is relatively safe in the canoe with me until I push you in. That difference makes a difference about whether or not the deal that I offer is mutually beneficial or harmful. I actually put you in the position where my offer is the best offer that you have. And that makes it look more like coercion than the other case. I think that when we can identify cases where somebody changed their baseline situation, making them worse off than they were, and then come along and take advantage of that, exploiting them, then we've got something that should be prevented. When we don't have that, if it's looks more like the mutually beneficial kind of case, do we want somebody to come along and interfere with that transaction? So now imagine the first case again, where I didn't put you in the water. I just happened by and I'm in a position to save you. But I save you in this really nasty way by taking advantage of you and demanding $10,000 to save you. Imagine that there's a third party who's in a position that they could prevent that transaction from taking place. If they say, "No, I'm not going to prevent this from happening. I'm not going to permit this to happen. I'm not going to let this person exploit you for $10,000 to save you." If that means that I'm not going to save you because they're preventing the transaction, aren't you actually the person in the water? Aren't you saying, no, please don't prevent this transaction. Please stay out of it. Please mind your own business. right? Don't you want to be saved?